And it's not so important to understand how it's doing, because if it's just giving valid results and you can do it easily, it shouldn't be a problem if you don't understand. I don't know if anyone understands the machine learning, what it's
Right,
actually doing.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it is certainly the case, and I expect, as part of the slow adoption of machine learning models is it is less predictable. And I'll give you one anecdote, and I'll from talking with others, we've also seen this. So, when you do cut point models or regression models, it's very clear how they operate,
Mm.
and you can just look at the model and say, okay, well, based on the way this model is developed, if somebody has 0 counts, then their energy expenditure is going to be 2.1 METs, right? And if
Mm.
they put 1,000 counts in, then their energy expenditure will be this. Machine learning models sometimes give outputs that are, especially in the energy expenditure realm, that are not physiologically possible, right?
Mm.
And so whereas a regression model, like this thing can't possibly spit out less than 2.1 METs, there have been occasions with our machine learning models that we'll get negative values for energy expenditure,
Mm.
or we'll get values of 36 METs or something that's just, it's so extremely high that that that's not physiologically possible. And so we tried to understand, okay, that's not, that's just the nature of machine learning. Is it's black box. We don't understand how it works and what inputs are affecting that to give us these values that are not tenable. But what we can do is you can set up a floor function and say, okay, well, anything that the model spits out less than a MET, you just reassign a value of 1 MET, and
Mm.
that takes care of any or any negative or non-physiologically possible values on the low end. And then depending on your population, you can do the same thing with the ceiling function and say, okay, if we're dealing with older adults, nobody's going to have a maximal capability of more than 12 METs. So any
Mm.
values you see more than 12 METs, you just reassign to 12 METs, right? And
Mm.
and so you can make some of the concerns about machine learning a lot less concerning, or more easy to deal with some very simple steps like that.
Mm.
And we've done this, and I know of at least 2 other research groups who independently did the same type of thing, and we never communicated about it. But then when we did, it's like, oh, I'm glad we're all handling this weird situation the same way,
Mm.
And so I think you can remove some of the concerns about how these function by putting in some fairly easy things like that.
Mm. Yeah, really, really good points about machine learning methods. So now we have been discussing the validation studies and the features of those and new methods. If we quickly discuss also your validation paper you did about the Fibion devices. So
Yeah.
what was the goal of the validation study and the rationale behind it?
Yeah. So, when we talk about research grade devices, there's a fair bit of variability even within the what I would consider the research focused types of devices. Some of which, don't. Some of which focus mainly on the raw data outputs and then leave it to the researchers to derive the metrics that they want from that,
Mm.
whether that's energy expenditure, activity type, whatever. And then you have to choose the models you use to derive those outcomes. Some of the research grade devices, though, also provide their own proprietary outputs. And so when I think about that, I think about like Actigraph. You have to choose models if you want things like METs or MVPA or sedentary behavior, but the step counting metric is proprietary, and that just spits out, or reports the number of steps, either in,
Mm.
minute level increments or daily levels, depending on what you want. And so that's a value that's more similar to like a Fitbit, right? It just gives you the steps. You take the steps at face value. You can do the same thing with Actigraph. ActivePAL, the thigh worn device, does the same thing. You can get raw data, or it will tell you how many steps you take, and it has its own proprietary metabolic
Mm.
equivalent equation, and it will tell you the postures without you having to do any kind of input. And the Fibion device is similar to that, where you don't, as the user, have to make any decisions. It will report time in high intensity activity, and it will report time sitting. And so there's an attractive element to that, where it removes a lot of the decision making around, what is the best model that I apply to this data. But also, because it's a research or more of a researcher focused device, you avoid some of the pitfalls of the consumer wearables in terms of like, will they update the firmware? And, the consumer wearables a lot of times are, I think, focused on the elements that people will find attractive, like, having competitions and having like really cool apps that go along with it to make them fun to look at and stuff. And so, if you're spending more time doing that, what's the quality of the data you're actually getting, if that's not your main focus, versus the companies where it really is the main focus. And so
Mm.
I like those elements of the companies like Fibion or ActivePAL or ActiveGraph that do also provide some proprietary metrics developed by their own companies, but still retain a lot of the advantages of the the research grade wearable versus a consumer wearable.
Mm.
So yeah, I mean, in our lab, we're always looking for new devices that come out. What's the newest device? Whenever devices come out, we have kind of the same set of things we have to learn about them before people deploy them out in the field. Are they reliable? If you look at them between different devices, like within the same company. So if you take two Fibions and you put them next to each other, do you get the same output? That's
Mm.
a really important first question we have to ask. How does a new device compare to existing devices that are supposed to do similar things? So, the Fibion device is very much marketed as either a thigh worn or a pocket worn device. Okay, well, the standard thigh worn device in the field is ActivePAL. So let's understand how this new device compares to what most people looking for a thigh worn device would be more familiar with. And so when we did this study over the last couple of years, those were our main questions. Were, okay, let's take this Fibion device and let's compare it to itself to make sure it's sufficiently reliable. Let's make sure it has a certain level of accuracy. So you have to do that, or we did it in a laboratory protocol where we had known activities that we could compare to. And then also, how does it compare to the thing or the standard in the field that most researchers would be aware of? And that's the ActivePAL. And so we set up our study then to really ask the same questions of both devices. And so by doing that, then we could understand how the Fibion stacks up. Is the reliability going to be as good as Fibion or as ActivePAL? Is the accuracy as good? Those types of questions. And so again, we kind of view this as a fundamental. You have to do this as devices are developed. We have to understand how and how well they work. And if we don't do that, we're just hoping that they work, right? Which I
Mm.
don't know is always a safe assumption.
Mm.
So that was the setup. We had, I think it was 19 people in the study, 19 participants who were adults. And we did both a laboratory protocol where we had known activities. So they laid down for a minute or two at a time. And we recorded the exact start and stop time so we could compare the data, the criterion data, what we knew they were doing in terms of an activity type, to what was reported by the ActivePAL and by the Fibion devices. We had a reliability component. So we had people wear the devices on the left leg and the right leg. You would assume that, I mean, when we walk, we take the same number of steps with your left foot as with your right foot. There may be subtle differences according to preferred side of the body, but you should get pretty much the same data from each side of your body, right? If you didn't, that would be kind of a strange. It would be a strange set of behaviors you were doing to have substantially different data from your
Yeah.
left leg to your right leg. And so we did a reliability analysis comparing left and right leg. And then we did that in a free living setting. And then we compared the devices to each other. So what is,
Mm.
if we take, let's just isolate the left leg. If you compare the ActivePAL worn on the left leg, how does it compare to the Fibion worn on the left leg? And so we were able to look at between devices as well as within devices, and how well they captured the metrics that they were looking to capture. So that was the setup of our study. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, interesting and good setup. So how were the results?
Yeah, so I think it's important to consider, when you have proprietary metrics like Fibion does, like ActivePal does, for let's say postures or activity types that people are doing or they're reported, you can only measure those activities then. So for example,
Mm.
one metric that the Fibion does not or did not have, at least at the time we validated it, was a lying down metric.
Mm.
So when people are lying down, it's reported as sitting because of the angle of the thigh, minimal movement. And so, we when we did our validation, we had them lie down and we said, okay, well, obviously the Fibion can't tell you lying down. It's not one of the reported metrics, but what it should report is sitting. If it reports it as
Mm.
sitting, we at least have confidence that it's, when people laid down in the field, it would be captured as a sedentary metric, which is what lying down is too, right? And so we had to do some, I guess, pre-thinking about that, right? Or if we
Mm.
have somebody do, oh, I don't know, let's see, what activities did we have? We had them do jogging. I can't remember if jogging's reported or if it's just high intensity activity by the
Yeah, high
Fibion.
intensity. Yeah.
And so, okay, it doesn't report jogging as a metric, but does it report, would it capture jogging as high intensity activity? And if it
Mm.
does, we consider that, good enough given the constraints of the variables that it reports.
Mm.
So those types of things. So you got to have a good understanding of what the device does report, and then how the activities you test should be reported by that. We found pretty good accuracy for the most part with the Fibion device. I believe the times the Fibion device misreported were lying on your side. So if you were laying down but on your left side or your right side, that wasn't
Mm.
always reported as sitting, which I'd have to go back and look to see what it was reported as instead. But again, that was a case in which we seemed to find some errors. The other place that we would find, but this would not be surprising based on the movement, sometimes cycling is a distinct activity recognized by Fibion, and so is walking. And walking, I believe, is split into slow and fast walking
Yeah.
within the Fibion software. And so there were cases in which slow walking was confused as fast walking, or fast walking confused as slow walking. There was also occasional cases where walking was confused as cycling, or vice versa.
Mm.
So, you think about the movement of the leg, the fact that that's a consistent ambulatory looking pattern. It's not necessarily surprising that those metrics were sometimes I guess, misidentified. The other
Mm.
challenge, though, with the walking metrics is I'm guessing there's some kind of a cadence based threshold. If
Mm.
you're above 100 steps per minute, it's fast walking. If you're below, it's slow, or whatever that threshold would be. Well, different people walk at the same speed using different cadences, and so if we
Yeah.
use a 3 mile an hour threshold, that might be moderate, or that might be high intensity for me and low intensity for someone else, based on the fact that I have a shorter stride length than somebody
Mm.
else does. And so anytime you do a validation like that, you have to kind of be aware of some of those potential limitations with the activities you select are. So again, it's not necessarily that the Fibion's wrong. It is recognizing something different than what we maybe intended for it to try to
Mm.
recognize. And
Mm.
so again, and then you have to think about, well, what does that mean, right? From a health standpoint, do I consider fast walking to be meeting recommendations and slow walking not to be? And if so, then that differentiation matters. But if I'm really just interested in how much time are you active in the day versus how much time are you sedentary in the day, it doesn't matter whether the Fibion reports walking is slow or fast walking. Both of them are active time, and so you're not concerned about that differentiation.
Mm.
Frankly, for me, if fast walking was misidentified as cycling or vice versa, I probably wouldn't care, because both of those are health promoting activities. They'd contribute to guidelines. It's better than sitting on a bus or driving a car, because it's active transport versus passive or sedentary transport. And so for me, that would be a less concerning misrepresentation
Mm.
of the activity,
Mm.
versus if they're capturing sedentary metrics as movement or something like that. That's obviously a bigger concern. So we report accuracy statistics in the paper, and it does pretty well. It's easily within the 80s, 80 to 90% for correctly identifying activities. I think the context, though, is when it's misreported, how big of a deal is it that it misreported? And in some
Mm.
cases, it is a big deal, and in some cases, again, I would argue that it probably doesn't matter from a behavioral, or how we would interpret someone's data if they're
Mm.
cycling versus walking. Those are both still good activities to do,
Mm.
right? And so that was our accuracy findings from the paper. In terms of reliability, when you looked at the left leg versus the right leg data, the reliability was almost the same for the Fibion device as it was for the ActivePAL.
Mm.
So in terms of trying to understand, change over time, like if we had people doing pre and post intervention, or summer versus winter to look at how season affects physical activity
Mm.
levels, the Fibion appeared to us to be as good a device as the ActivePAL at trying to recognize those, potential change over time metrics. And so that was a positive finding for us. It's working equivalently well to existing devices in the field. And then the third big analysis we did was we tried to compare metrics from the ActivePAL to the Fibion itself, which was
Mm.
difficult because they don't capture the same outputs. So ActivePAL measures, they have a sedentary metric, and Fibion doesn't. So
Mm,
we had to take the ActivePAL sedentary data plus the sitting data, and we anticipated, okay, well, that would be the combined sedentary metric that would then be the closest we can get to Fibion,
mm,
right? ActivePAL has two different types of sitting. They have primary, or of lying down. They have primary and secondary lying down. So primary lying down is thought to correspond to sleep time, so it's lying down at night for extended
mm,
periods of time, versus secondary lying is more meant to capture daytime lying down. So if maybe it's a nap, or maybe it's just you're laying on the couch watching TV or whatever, but it double you have to be careful about how you add them together so they don't get double counted. So there's all these little, nuances when you're doing the data. And so we tried it all different kinds of ways to see if we could get any comparability between the two devices. The end of the story was that the two devices were not comparable to each other. So the outputs reported from the Fibion were not equivalent to the outputs reported from the ActivePAL. That is not surprising. It's different companies. It's different, again, different goals for what outputs, and it's totally consistent if you were to compare ActivePAL to Actigraph or to GeneActive or to Activity. It's pretty unlikely that manufacturer-specific outputs of energy expenditure or activity type would be equivalent between device brands. And so that was entirely expected, I guess I would say. And really what that means is that for, you know, to give yourself best confidence in the data, it's probably best to use the same brand of device if you're looking again at change over time or comparing groups or those types of things.
mm. Yeah. So again, like we discussed in the first part about complexities of validations, that you have different variables. If you have primary lying down, secondary, and then sedentary behavior, how do you compare? And you've done good work of really looking
Yeah,
those
thanks. And
different ones.
that's part of what makes this stuff fun, right? On the surface, validation studies can seem very routine and very boring. And it's like, oh yeah, of course, you just pick up a device, you see what metrics it outputs, you find a criterion, a true measure of those things, and then you set up the study. And so that gets boring if you're just doing the exact same protocol, with different devices over time. But each device has its own nuances, and you can explore ways of trying to see if you can get better interpretation of outputs and those kinds of things. So I really enjoy that element of the validation studies. That's what keeps them fun.
Mm. Yeah, and you mentioned that the cycling and walking can be mixed together. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
quite challenging, especially if you can cycle also standing sometimes,
Yes.
especially in the free living normal life.
Yep.
It's very difficult to distinguish it from the walking, and especially if you stop in the traffic lights and so on. So
Yeah.
it's maybe with the ergometer, with the certain height and certain rhythm, it's you can distinguish, but yeah, free
Right.
living, it gets much more
It gets very, very difficult. Yeah.
more complicated.
Yep.
So what would you say that were the main conclusions, maybe the main findings, again, like the very main point of the results?
From the Fibion ActivePAL
Yeah.
comparison
Yeah.
paper. Yeah. So for most of the reported metrics, the Fibion device seemed to have pretty high accuracy in a laboratory setting. So, measuring things like sitting, standing, walking, cycling behavior, the device was generally accurate at recognizing that those
Mm,
activities that happened. When you get into the free living setting, there's not perfect reliability. There never is. So it was helpful to have a comparison. We found that for the metrics that were reported by the Fibion device, they were about as reliable as the ActivePAL device. So just
mm,
for example, if we find that slow walking time was 3% different between the Fibion and the active, or the Fibion on the left leg and the Fibion on the right leg, we would expect to see about a 3% difference in walking time from the ActivePAL as
mm,
well. So
mm,
again, are they perfect? No, but they're pretty close, and they're as close. The Fibion was as close to each other as the ActivePAL was to each other when you compared them across legs. And then the third conclusion was don't use different brands of device when trying to compare data. So when we looked at outcomes like, stepping time, high intensity time, even non-wear time was not the same between device brands.
mm. Yeah, thanks. Very, very nice and nicely done study. Maybe we start to wrap up, and you mentioned that from our first recording you get the collaboration. So
Yeah.
please feel free to advertise what kind of collaborators you are looking,
Yeah.
what kind of data you would like to see. Free
Sure.
word.
Yeah, yeah, I'll give a couple thoughts on this. One of them is that, in my time being in this field, especially if you want to do more than just use the simple device outputs that come from devices. One way you can do that is to learn it yourself as the researcher, as the end user, how to do some basic coding, or how to even just set up some of the processes to make the analysis faster. I mean, even if you're getting just steps output from an actigraph device, that can still be pretty time intensive if you have large sample sizes and maybe you're not too savvy with Excel to, find ways to do automatic calculations of stuff. So you can either learn it yourself, or I guess I think about myself like a statistician does. Like, could I learn to go and do logistic regression or multivariate analyses or some of those things? Probably, with enough time and effort. Or I could go find somebody who's a noted expert in those fields and ask for collaboration, which saves me a ton of time. It
Mm.
ensures the data is being handled the most appropriate way. And I think it's better to work together than in isolation. New people have new ideas, insights, and perspectives. And so you're almost always better off in a team than you are on your own. And so, from a physical activity measurement side, I kind of view myself that same way, where, I have, and fortunately, the last few years, I've been able to collaborate with a ton of different organizations and groups about things I don't know anything about. I don't know, I know hardly anything about rheumatoid arthritis or other rheumatic conditions, but I'm collaborating on a study because they need to measure physical activity in that population. And so I've been able to come in and give some insights about how we do this. And okay, you're telling me that this specific population has these movement limitations, maybe with how fast they move or the types of movements they do. So now I can give you some better insights on what type of device will best capture those activities in that population. And here's how we analyze the data. And so, again, it takes some of the burden off the researchers who are subject matter experts, because they can focus on that and then they can farm out or consult out the elements that I can, be a better value on. And so, yeah, anybody considering using device based measures of physical activity or sedentary behavior, that's, I've been doing this for 11 years now. And so I love doing this stuff. I like to think that I've gotten pretty good at it over time. And if it's an area that I don't know about, I also know a lot of other people in the field who could potentially be collaborators or consultants. And so, love the opportunity to talk to different groups about what they're doing and what they're trying to measure, and what the considerations would look like as people are trying to conduct their studies. Yeah, so that's one thing I just wanted to say. And again, love doing collaborations. The other one, because so that's the physical activity measurement field. Something I've done the last couple of years, partly because of interest of the students I have at my institution, is I've worked pretty far outside the physical activity measurement realm the last maybe 3 or 4 years, and started doing work in ergogenic aids. So, in trying to enhance sport performance, which has been a really fun new area. It's been humbling because I go from feeling like I know most of what's going on in the activity wearable field to knowing virtually nothing about some of these studies I've been working on. One of the things I've noticed, though, being I guess I call myself a measurement researcher. So we generally measure physical activity, but when we get into some of these other fields and we're trying to measure, power outputs in these athletes, or you're trying to measure, I mean, whatever these variables are, so many of the principles I've learned in physical activity measurement about thinking about test reliability or test validity, or, has this test actually been done in this population and is this appropriate thing? So many of those skills have actually translated over into these other fields. And so I end up doing a lot of similar studies in a very different type of field, because you notice these big gaps that exist. And so, I've kind of realized how beneficial it can be to have an outside perspective in a
Mm.
field, and realize that so many different fields of research grapple with the same challenges. And so getting sometimes out of your narrow box of expertise, and looking at different areas, you can both contribute a lot to those because you bring a unique perspective, but you can also learn a lot that you can bring back to your home field as well. I mean, this is definitely not a one-way street. I think that physical activity researchers have learned a lot from fields like engineering, and we shouldn't be reinventing the wheel in each one of these research fields. What can we learn about from another field that's maybe more developed than ours, some of the challenges they face, some of the conventions they have for collecting or analyzing their data, and what can we bring over to our field? And then conversely, what can we contribute to our field that may help others? And so I've benefited a lot from moving out of my main area and getting into a new area. And I guess I would encourage other people to try to do the same, because I think there's a lot of value in that.
Hmm. Yeah, that's good. So anyone, if you have device-based physical activity data and maybe need help with the data analysis and make it faster and better, don't hesitate to be in contact with Alex. How do people contact you?
Yeah, I can share my email address with you, Ali,
Yeah,
phone number, any of those things. I am on Twitter. I don't. I mean, I would probably reply eventually if people try to reach out, something like that. So yeah, probably institutional email or phone number, and we can make sure that gets in. Yeah, it gets in the show notes. But it's my last name, Montoyeah at elma.edu is email address. Yeah.
yeah, perfect. Thank you. This was a pleasure once again to chat with you.
Thank you, Ali. I appreciate the opportunity. It's always good to talk to you as well.